Thanks everybody for having me and for attending this talk. As Roel already said, I will be talking about our paper, which is called Relative Entropy Pathwise Policy Optimization. It's a little bit of a mouthful, but for the purpose of this talk, I have given it a slightly more BAMI name, which is on policy value learning at 10,000 frames per second. And what I kind of want to do here is walk you through the intuitions of how to build on policy RL algorithms, not completely from scratch, because obviously a lot of the components, as always, are recombinations of existing pieces. But the core drive that led us to starting this work was really rethinking how you can improve upon the very established standard of just running PPO on millions of samples and having your policy improvement from that. So what I basically want to do is look at the building blocks that underlie actor-critic RL. And especially, I want to take a closer look at how do the critic updates and the actor updates, so that is your value function in your policy, in these on-policy actor-critic algorithms, how do they interact? How do they support each other? And where do potential problems or suboptimal behaviors come from that we might be able to improve upon? So, why is this an interesting story? This is an interesting story because fundamentally, at the very, very heart of actor-critic algorithms, we find a huge split in the literature. There's basically two foundational paradigms of how you can run your actor updates in actor-critic algorithms. So everything starts from, I've tried to simplify this notationally a lot, everything starts from the core goal of any common actor-critic algorithm. There's probably some that don't fully follow this, but bear with me, for any actor-critic algorithm, is to find a policy gradient. So what is a policy gradient? A policy gradient is basically just an update to the parameters of my policy. Policy can be anything, right? You could think about this in terms of large language models. You can think of this in terms of the very small multi-layer MLP networks that we use for robotic locomotion tasks. But the core question is just, okay, I run my policy in my environment, I get some return, very commonly denoted as J here. And now what tweaks, what changes do I need to make to my parameters of my policy to improve this return? One path to doing this is the venerable reinforce or score-based gradient estimation. So this is basically a mathematical trick. I won't walk through it in detail because it's extremely well established in the literature. You can find tutorials on this in basically any reinforced PPO, TRPO explainer. You basically rearrange this equation. But to take a step back, why do we have to rearrange this equation at all? The fundamental problem on a mathematical level that we have to deal with is in this top equation, we're taking the gradient of parameters with regard to an expectation, where the expectation itself depends on those parameters, right? You have expectation of X sampled from some policy, X dependent on theta here. Basically, what we need to do to make this amenable to batch gradient descent is we need to rearrange this whole equation in such a way that we don't get a gradient of an expectation, but an expectation of a gradient. Because an expectation of a gradient, we can safely approximate with samples from this expectation. And this is exactly what the reinforced trick does at the end of the day. it uses a mathematical reformulation of this gradient to be able to pull the gradient inside of the expectation. And now we can approximate this with samples. Now, the second problem that PPO solves is you have this return estimate. This return estimate, if you only compute it from the actual samples you have in your environment, is going to have very, very high variance. So what you will normally find is that this return estimate is replaced with some form of advantage estimate. The standard setup for PPO here is what is called the generalized advantage estimator. And I'll actually show you a form of this later on if you're not completely familiar with. Other algorithms in this family, like for example, TRPO, have even more simplistic advantage estimators where they basically just subtract the mean return over several trajectories from the return estimate for each individual trajectory. I have to quickly ask, there is a very loud leaf blower out of my window. Is this making me more or less audible right now?
You're good.
Okay, then praise be to the noise cancellation. So, sorry. What is an alternative to this? Now, the alternative to this is what has been commonly called the deterministic policy gradient. Now, there is a tiny little problem with that, is that the deterministic policy gradient theorem was established to be able to use deterministic policies in this equation above, but you can kind of use it again also for stochastic policies, which is why I very often like to call it either a reparameterization or a pathwise gradient estimator. So how does that work? What you're doing in this particular instance is you're trying to exploit two other tricks, not the reinforce or score-based trick, but you're going to be using first a trick that is very commonly used in variational autoencoders, which is reparameterization. Basically, if we can reparameterize our expectation to depend on a source of noise that doesn't depend on the parameters we're trying to estimate, so that our expectation doesn't depend directly on theta, then we can just pull the gradient in. And how you normally do this is, for example, if your policy is parameterized as a Gaussian, we parameterize the policy mean and standard deviations as deterministic functions of our state. And then we sample the noise from a standard Gaussian. And this is what's commonly called the reparameterization trick. If you have unit Gaussian sample noise, you add a mean, you multiply the whole thing by the standard deviation. Other way around, you multiply by the standard deviation first and then add the mean. Then you can estimate a gradient with regards to the mean and the standard deviation. And the expectation that you sample from doesn't depend on the parameters. So that's the first trick we're trying to do. But now we still have a gradient that depends on our return. And the problem is, if my return is basically just the sum of my rollout, or for example, in an LLM, right, my return might just be my final token RLHF reward or verifier reward, that chain, that decoding chain, is not actually differentiable. If I wanted to do this in a robotic simulator, for example, I would have to differentiate both the reward function and the whole simulator dynamics function with regard to the policy. Worst case, that gradient doesn't even exist. So I need a second trick here. Instead of directly differentiating J, what I do is I learn a differentiable surrogate, I train a Q function, a critic, that approximates J, and it is differentiable. And then I take a gradient of that critic, of that approximation, instead of having to differentiate my whole actual policy rollout. So this gives us the two big family of vector updates. One, which I like to call kind of the reinforce heritage, And then the other one, which really comes from the deep deterministic policy gradient and then gets reused in things like TD3 and SAC. The branching points are really here two things. First, how do I get my gradient? In one case, the reinforce, and in the other case, the reparameterization. And then how do I approximate my returns? In one case with these generalized intervention estimates, in the other case is just directly with a trained Q function. So where do we find these methods used? And here there is an interesting pattern that emerges. We very often use value function learning. So the second branch that I was talking about, if we have just one nth, or more generally, if gathering samples is relatively expensive. We very often get very sample efficient training from value function based methods. We get relatively stable policy improvement if you do a bunch of tricks to basically make the optimization of the critic behave well. And after only 2 to 10 hours of waiting, depending on how good your machine is, you get a, for example, like stick figure humanoid. This is the venerable DM control benchmark that is able to run reasonably well over hurdles, etc. Now, there is a second paradigm, which is very, very common in robotics, especially locomotion robotics. What if we have just a lot of parallel simulators that run really, really, really fast with something like GPU acceleration, etc.? Can we still have value functions? Yes, but people normally don't use that. More n's means more speed, and so people use the fastest algorithm that we have, which is PPO, and just train, right? Basically, you don't really care about the sample efficiency that the value function training gives you anymore. You just go, right? You basically sample the ever-loving out of your environments. You get a huge amount of data, and you brute force the whole problem with a score-based algorithm. That works. Now the question is this the best thing you can do? And to really understand the nuanced differences between these two paradigms, we're going to look at some really, really basic examples and look at how these algorithms actually behave, what gradient paths they take on some very, very toy examples. So how can we understand how good or bad these value function, these policy gradient approximations actually are? So what I did here was I ran policy gradient as an optimization method on a 2D example. So basically, the state is just wherever you are right now, and the action is wherever you want to go next, constrained in some small circle. And the dynamics is very easy. You just go to wherever you want to go next. And here, shaded on the right in gray, is basically your objective function. So the goal is to reach this optimum that is marked in a star here. Lighter color basically just means higher return. So what do we have here? In red, we have what I term to the Monte Carlo policy gradient or a reinforced gradient. In orange, I basically have a sneaky thing. In orange, we have kind of the ground truth gradient. So this optimization function is relatively easy. So remember how I said earlier, but in like realistic tasks, we cannot differentiate the objective function. Well, here I can differentiate the objective function. So I can get kind of the ground truth perfect policy gradient that we get from reparameterization and differentiating the objective function. And you can immediately see if you compare the orange curve, which sadly is kind of hidden behind the others here a little bit. I hope the colors come through. And the red curve is we can immediately see one of the major drawbacks of these Monte Carlo policy gradients, which is that they have extremely high variance. Now, this is well documented in the literature. There is a bunch of tricks that we do to stabilize this high variance in PPO. We use relatively large batches. We use clipping, etc. But even with those stabilizations, you will normally get a very noisy policy gradient. Now, what I have in green and blue here are what I called a weak surrogate pathwise policy gradient and a strong surrogate pathwise policy gradient. What I basically did is I mimicked SIC and I trained a neural network to approximate this return landscape here from samples. And what I basically just did is I trained one very small neural network for not enough steps, that gives us the green curve, and one reasonably large neural network for a reasonable amount of steps, and that gives us the blue curve. And this really highlights the main problems that you get from something like SAC. You get the stable gradient estimation from a direct differentiation of your objective. But if your critic isn't accurate enough, then you're basically trapped in this green regime, and we just never reach optimal performance. If my critic doesn't fully understand or capture which actions are the best, then I can never recover them. So the quality of your critic is very important to understand. In something like SAC, is a hard bound on how good your policy can possibly become, because the only thing your policy is optimized for is finding the action that the critic thinks is best. If the critic is wrong, we're just never going to find the correct action. But if we do have a strong critic in blue here, we perform on par or actually even better than the ground truth estimate. This tiny gap here has caused a lot of people to question my setup here. There is a funny advantage that you can sometimes have with a learned approximation of your return, which is your critic can be slightly smoother and therefore easier to optimize than even the ground truth. This is very hit or miss, though. You shouldn't necessarily rely on it. There is a bunch of interesting papers on when differentiating ground truth trajectories can be worse, but I won't get into the details. Now, I want to build a little bit more intuition for another advantage that having a critic brings us. And this is what happens if we want to reuse data. If you think about a standard PPO setup, we sample a bunch of trajectories on policy, and then we update our policy with the PPO gradient for several epochs. And to ensure that we don't completely run off the rails, we use the clipping. But really, I want you to understand what happens if I compute a policy gradient and reuse it for several epochs. And to do that, we actually have to look at the math and look at what is the actual gradient signal in a policy gradient. What I have here, I'm going to do this in the discrete case, even though all of my experiments otherwise are in the continuous case, just because the math becomes a lot easier to understand here. What I have here is the gradient of your logits, so basically the pre-softmax output of your neural network that you get from a reinforced style estimator. So the reinforced style estimator basically says, take the gradient of your logit and then of your neural network that produces the logit. That is multiplied by the advantage estimation of the action I that you actually took. And then you just take the log of your policy, which in this case, in any discrete case, is basically just the softmax. So this is basically exactly analogous to any case where you would have a discrete policy, for example, an LLM. So here the question is basically, if we translate this to an LLM, what is the gradient of the token probability or the token logit that was not actually part of my trajectory? We can do some relatively simple math, we see that the log fraction here, we can decompose it into a subtraction. The gradient is independent of this first factor, so that's just 0. And in the second case, we take the gradient of the logarithm, so that is 1 divided by f of x and then times the derivative. So we end up with the softmax itself again. But this time, the softmax with regard to the token that we are now looking at the gradient of. So that is just the probability of sampling this other token. So what does that mean? We're doing gradient descent, so there's a negative. If the advantage of the action that I took, of the token that my LLM actually output, is negative, if this was a worse than average decision, we increase the likelihood of all of the other tokens, and we increase that likelihood proportional to how likely that other token already was. So likely tokens get relatively more gradient to them. To break this down even further, I have visualized this whole thing because just staring at the pure math might not fully get the intuition across. Let's say this is, for an arbitrary 5 actions, the likelihood of taking an action. And I'm taking the second action, and I see that it's good. It's better than average. What happens to the whole probability now? We increase the likelihood of this one action, and proportional to how likely the other actions were, we decrease their likelihood. If we had a bad action, we would do the exact opposite. We would decrease the likelihood of the bad action and increase the likelihood of all of the other ones. Now here I want you to notice something. We're increasing the likelihood of all of the other ones proportional to how likely they were, but we currently have no signal on whether, for example, the first or the third action are actually better. We increase them, but we don't have signal on whether they're actually good actions. So the core question here really is, how much should we trust this change? We do this change. What happens at the next update step now? What PPO does is we run through the whole thing again. So we just keep decreasing the second action and increasing everything else. We do, after the first update step, get an importance sampling term, which I've just abbreviated as W here. But the importance sampling term is constant for all of these actions. So we're just scaling how much of a gradient step we take, but we can never change direction. With the critic, however, what we can do now in our second update step is we can say, wait. Critic, Q function. What if we took our first action now? Would this actually be good or not? And if the critic says, yes, this is a good action, this is what I've shown on the right-hand side here, then see what suddenly happens. Instead of increasing all of the other action probabilities, we actually decrease them because we found an action that we think is good. And the more update steps you do, the more you can resample in a critic-based setup and double check whether you actually think your new policy gives you the correct actions. So one of the things I want you to take away from here is critics, and especially Q function critics, allow us to resample in our policy gradient. They allow us to query counterfactually, how good do we think an action is that we didn't actually take while we were collecting our data. This is crucial, as we will see later. So I've visualized this here again we're back at my original example. I have now visualized not one gradient path, but multiple gradient paths, all starting from the same source. And I want you to take a look at the second and the third picture. So the left-hand side is reinforced. That is if we resample the actions at every step of the gradient we take. The second and the third is importance sample reinforced. So this is what you normally do when you run PPO. You run multiple iterations on your gathered data. And you can really see this thing that we just mathematically derived. You see that each one of these paths is almost perfectly straight. They're a little bit curved because there is a log in there. But the reason all of these paths, all of these different paths are straight is because I just keep repeating the same equation that I just told you, right? I decrease the likelihood of all of the actions that I didn't want to take, and I increase the likelihood of the one action that I found, or vice versa. But what I can never do is kind of correct my step. Basically, the direction that my first policy gradient pointed in is the direction that all other updates in this epoch, in the next coming epochs will follow, will also take. And the clipping does not actually change this. The only thing that the clipping does, which is almost imperceptible here, is stop these paths from going too far out. But it will not course correct. The pathwise policy gradient, and it's kind of hard to see because it already has such incredibly small variance to begin with, can actually course correct a little bit at every time step because of this resampling capability that I just talked about. So let's say I really, really wanted to exploit all of these great properties of critics in unpolicy RL. What do I need to do to build an algorithm that actually does that? Well, we need to have a policy class that is reparameterizable. This is pretty easy in general. Most standard distributions allow for a reparameterization, or, for example, in the case of a discrete distribution, so for a discrete action space, we can at least get a relatively low variance approximation of the reparameterization. If anybody's interested in later on, I can briefly talk about that. The more important thing is, I stressed this earlier, is we need to get a really precise critic. We need to get a really, really good critic. And to be competitive with something like PPO, we need to get this fast, and it cannot be too expensive, right? Because the quality of a critic upper bounds how good we're going to get. And the speed of the critic, just the speed of the critic training, basically just determines how practical this algorithm will be. And then the question is, if we have all of this, do we actually get accurate policy gradients? So now we come to the actual algorithm development part. So far, we've only done problem analysis. The question we will now focus on is, can we learn an on-policy state action value function? And what else do we need to do? So this is where we basically now get to the meat of what is the REPO algorithm, relative entropy pathwise policy optimization. As mentioned in the beginning, we just recently presented this as iClear. And I like to think of algorithm development a little bit like cooking or a recipe. We have all of these different components. We have all of these different problems that we need to solve, and all of these different components that we can solve those problems with. So how do we cook a good on-policy value function? The first thing we need to do is get good targets for our value training fast. This is where we will be using TD Lambda targets, which are basically slightly reflavored PPO generalized advantage estimates. We need trust regions. Why do we need trust regions still if we have value functions? We'll get to that in a quick second. We need entropy regularization. This is something that we basically just inherited from starting from SAC, but it's going to be very useful, and I'm going to show you why. And then we need to find a good architecture, because there has been a lot of work in recent years that shows Critic training is actually very architecture dependent, whether it's stable or not. So let's talk about what these components are and why we need them. What is a TD lambda target? So if you have a sequence of states that your policy visits, you get a reward at every state, unless you're in LLM land and you've committed to only ever getting a return at the very, very end of your trajectory. I'm very sorry if you are in that land, but so many of the cooler tricks don't really apply. But assume you get some return at every, some reward at every time step. What you can do is compute also a Q function at every time step. The Q function is basically just how good do I think I am at the current time step with my current policy. So the standard TD target is just R plus gamma Q at the next state. Okay, that's fine. But what I could also do is compute a two-step TD target. R at my current state, R at my next state, and then the Q function at the one after that. And I'm not going to belabor this for too long. I can play this whole game for a while. Now, basically, the nth target estimate can be represented as this function here. And now the question is, what's the point? Why should I do that? Why is like the zero estimate not good enough? What you will find, and this is very well established in the literature, is what we are dealing here is basically a bias variance trade-off. So a zero or one-step TD target, what I call G0 here, has relatively low variance because I only take a single step. So I'm only compounding the variance from my policy and my environment for a single step. But it has relatively high bias. Why does it have high bias? Well, because I'm relying on the Q function at the next state directly. And the Q function is potentially wrong, right? The Q function is my own estimate of how good my performance in this state is going to be. So if my Q function is wrong, that is going to be a biased target. It's not the correct target. If I increase the length I look ahead, I increase the variance. Why? Well, basically because of each possible policy future trajectory, I've only seen one that I'm summing across. But basically, the number of possible paths I could have taken with the stochasticity in my policy and my environment grows the more steps I do. However, my bias decreases. And why does my bias decrease? Because the gamma in front of the final Q function estimate gets a larger and larger exponent. So at one step, I might have gamma at 0.99. But if I take 100 or 1,000 steps, gamma to the 1,000 is essentially zero, right? So the relative importance of my Q estimate for my target is lower. Now, choosing the correct lambda, the correct n is very, very hard. So there's a trick, and that's basically just to compute all of these and sum them up with another weighing parameter that basically trades off bias and variance, the lambda. This trick is used in standard PPO. The only difference is that in standard PPO, you will subtract the value function baseline from this to get the advantage. Here we want actual Q targets. Okay, so ingredients 2 and 3 are trust region boundaries. Why do we need trust region boundaries still if we have value functions? So the problem is that we want to be computing our value functions on policy. So we only ever see data from our current policy. And my current policy explores some region of the state action space. I very abstractly marked this here in yellow. What happens now, what can happen now as I update my policy is basically two failure cases. One failure case I want to avoid is that I lose stochasticity in the state action space that my policy covers. I don't want to collapse to a deterministic policy. Why? Because that effectively just means that I've stopped exploring. And that I really only want to do if I'm really, really sure that I have a good policy. So the first thing we're going to be adding is a form of trust region bound, a KL bound, to a uniform policy. I always want to stay at least somewhat stochastic. And the KL to uniform policy, as those who have studied a little bit more math will know, is just the entropy of your policy. The other thing I want to do, the other thing I want to not do, is I don't want to move away or too far away from the state space region that I've covered. Why? Well, I never got data there yet. If I make a huge policy update, I will suddenly move to a completely different region of the state action space. And my Q function will just not be accurate anymore, right? Because my Q function was just trained on the data from this yellow region. So suddenly this whole thing that I've given so much thought of in terms of resampling, etc., well, you can't do that anymore because your Q function is not going to know how good an action is in a state that it's never seen before. So using standard ideas again from the literature, and this is also where the algorithm inherits this relative entropy part of the name. This is from the relative entropy policy search by Jan Peters from 2010. You want to bound how much can my policy move compared to the previous policy from which I gathered my last big data sample. So basically, if we do both of these things well, what we get is a new policy region marked here in this bluish gray that is just a little bit different from the region we've covered previously. The problem with these two is that we have two parameters now to deal with, this eta and epsilon here. Basically, how much can I move? And here we took a nice trick. What determines basically how much you can move is just how much weight you give these two terms, so the entropy term in red here, and the relative entropy term in orange. We can just basically give them weights. So the higher those weights are, the more important it'll be to have high entropy for the red term or very low relative entropy for the orange term. But these need to be balanced against our current Q function estimate. So we borrow a trick from SAC here. And what we say is, okay, we fix a minimum entropy and a maximum KL distance to our old policy. And we automatically tune these two parameters, the alpha and the beta. And the tuning is actually very simple. Every time we find that the current entropy of our policy is too small, we increase the alpha parameter so that our entropy term will be relatively more important. And every time we find that we violate the KL bound that we've set ourselves, we increase the beta parameter to make the KL part of the equation more important. And this turns out to work really, really nicely. Basically, all three of these terms stabilize themselves automatically relatively to each other, depending on how far you proceed. I'm actually, for lack of time, I'm going to skip this part because it turns out that the architecture is not as relevant as you would potentially think. I want to show you some of the results we actually got, and then maybe still have a little bit of time left over for questions. Right. So does this actually work? Does all of the theory I've talked about in the beginning actually happen in practice? This is a joke that I don't even know from whom I stole it, but it's not my joke originally. Basically, whenever somebody asks, does it work in a talk, the answer is yes, otherwise the talk wouldn't be happening. And the paper wouldn't have gotten accepted. Yes, this does work. And the first thing I want to show is basically the validation of this resampling part that I talked so much in the beginning about. what do we have here? So we have normalized returns over, I think, the DeepMind control suite from 4 instantiations of actor-critic algorithms. 3 are basically REPO variants, and 1 is PPO. So what are the 3 REPO variants? So the top one, the REPO Pathwise, is the one that I've talked about that has all of these different components that I just introduced, that differentiates through the Q function, reparameterizes everything. That gives us the best performance. The second one is really interesting. This is REPO, but it uses a PPO or reinforced style gradient estimate, and it resamples the actions. So basically what I do is I take my policy. For every batch, I sample an action from the policy. I compute the Q value or the advantage of that action. But then I compute the gradient not by differentiating through the Q, but by using the standard reinforced style. So the A times gradient of log pi. That works almost as well as vanilla REPO. Now the third algorithm I have here is PPO. And then the final one is REPO, but without resampling and using the score-based gradient estimator. So what can we conclude from here? Well, looking back at this picture I showed you of the variance over these policy paths, basically the top algorithm corresponds to the pathwise policy gradient that I've been claiming is really good. The second one basically is similar to a kind of like reinforced style gradient estimator, but being allowed to resample my actions quite frequently. And then PPO and the REPO with GAE are basically important sampling policy gradient estimators. And now we can really conclusively see, and this is why I've put so much effort on explaining this in the beginning, this ability to resample an action and re-query how good do we now think this action under my policy is with a critic, that is where a majority of the performance benefit actually comes from. Differentiating the Q function instead of taking the reinforced gradient gets you a little bit of a boost in performance, but the bulk of it is really from avoiding the important sampling to begin with. So, takeaway here is important sampling is extremely bad for the stability of your gradient estimator. And I think a lot of people really underestimate this. So, I'm going to run through these really quickly because this is basically just bragging that our algorithm works really, really well. We compared against a couple of baselines here. We compared it against PPO in 2 different variants because PPO performance depends catastrophically on tuning. So we tuned a PPO baseline a little bit to improve it. We also compare against the fast TD3 algorithm, which is basically similar to our approach here. It tries to just run TD3, and there was a newer version which is called fast SAC, with these large parallel environments. And what you can really see is that REPO is good. Whole takeaway, REPO is good and it's very stable. Now, what we also did is, instead of just staying in standard DeepMind control environments, which you will find in like your vanilla standard RL paper, is we took this to a bunch of other environment suites. So here, instead of doing the standard DeepMind control locomotion tasks, we moved to what are called the many-skill environments. So these are robot manipulation tasks. And in these tasks, you can really, really see how unstable PPO is. And for these tasks, we were actually interested in measuring how unstable PPO really is. So we took an idea from the literature, which is basically measuring not only performance, but reliable success. And the idea behind reliable success is, once you've reached a certain performance ceiling here, so for example, 90% success rate or 95% success rate, how likely is your algorithm to actually stay there and not drop down again? And when we measure that against PPO, you can see that on this metric, PPO really, really struggles. Why? Well, you can kind of see this in the top left corner. It struggles because it has such catastrophically high variance. So the takeaway here is REPO training leads to very stable training. So once you've reached a certain performance, you don't drop down again. Finally, we also took this to like a more exciting robotics benchmark, the ISAC lab environments. There isn't even a takeaway here anymore. This is basically just bragging that we're better than our competitors. There is something really interesting here is that our gap to PPO is not that large anymore. And this is really because these environments have been kind of co-designed with PPO. The designers of these environments have really run PPO for forever on them and have hyper fine-tuned the PPO hyperparameters and the reward functions in the environments to work well with PPO. So this is another really interesting thing to observe, is that whether an algorithm like PPO is good doesn't only depend on the algorithm itself. It depends on whether the environment is designed to be good with this algorithm. But even with these environments, which have been hyper optimized to be solvable by PPO, we still see a small but noticeable performance improvement from using REPO. I'm going to skip the ablation here and just, because we have only a few minutes to spare, give a big shout out to my collaborators who work with us on this paper. Axel, Marcel, and Michal were the student authors on this, and then Igor, Amir Masood, and Eric were the main faculty advisors on that. And yeah, I've talked for quite a while now. I hope I haven't lost most of the audience. But basically, if I want to look at the thing now, my slides will disappear. Oh God, people ask questions in the chat. Warning, I can see the chat, so you can ask your questions now. Yeah, go ahead, Kelvin.
Hi, great presentation. And I actually joined a little late. I want to ask something about environments.
Yes.
I'm an amateur in like the environment space, but what I understand is that a lot of these environments are, like a lot of these simulation environments are closed looped, like they're closed ended, right?
Yes.
So is there any consideration for open-ended environments that are generated? I've heard there are like these kind of environments that are open-ended that are, I believe they use diffusion models or something like that. I'm not too sure if my question is tight enough, but I hope you understand the motivation of what I'm trying to ask.
I think I understand what you're getting at. So right, for the purpose of these algorithms, we don't try to make too many assumptions about the way that the environment is constructed. Generally speaking, the more open-ended your environment, the harder the task is, right? Neither our algorithm nor most other Bayes algorithms have a lot of good components to deal with these problems. This is really kind of like dealing with open-ended environments. It's kind of a meta challenge, because open-endedness by itself, the problem becomes very quickly like hard out of distribution generalization, right? If it's open-ended, if I can keep finding new stuff, how do I know how to interact with new stuff? And so this becomes very, very quickly a question of, well, what kind of architectures allow me to generalize? What kind of pre-training data allows me to generalize? This very quickly kind of leaves the set of questions that are really well answerable by algorithm design. The algorithm design on the RL side, at least, is very much just considered with, okay, I have my objective function. How do I improve it the fastest, right? Hard out of distribution generalization, open-endedness, etc. That's kind of like a separate, really interesting set of challenges that need separate tools. And those tools are kind of orthogonal or complementary to the more optimization-focused tools. That's kind of my little vague answer.
That makes sense. Let me know if you don't mind, I have a follow-up.
I think there's somebody else. Amir,
Yeah.
do you want to go first? So that we...
No, it's okay if Kevin has follow-up questions.
Kelvin, go.
You mentioned that an open-ended environment may have out-of-distribution samples, but isn't even an open-ended environment still within some kind of distribution, which can then be learned through some kind of representation?
Oh, sure. But to me, open-ended, right? Oh, what does open-end mean is then the question. If we assume that there is some finite amount of scenarios, then that doesn't feel very open-ended to me, right? That just feels like I need more samples to find out everything, but then it's not open-ended anymore, right? Then it's just closed. Open-ended to me really seems like the scenario where I can't ever fully cover all of the space. Amir, do you want to go? Kevin gave thumbs up, so I feel like I've
Yeah, okay. First of all, thanks for your great presentation. And I was following up this work since you posted it on your Twitter, and congrats on getting acceptance on it. My question was about resampling. In continuous domain, we have an infinite number of samples.
Yes.
And in these kinds of domains, how do we are doing resampling? This was my question. Because do we, sample from other actions that we didn't take up to now? And
so we are always assuming a parameterized policy, right? So something that we can sample from. In a continuous environment, of course, we cannot really sample everything, but the intuition still holds, right? Getting more samples is better than just getting the one that my policy actually executed in the environment, and running away with it. So this is really the crux of the matter, right? Like yes, you don't get exhaustive sampling in a continuous action space, but more samples is still better, no matter whether they can be exhaustive or not.
Yeah, I wanted to see if, for example, there is, a trade-off, for example, in the number of resampling actions. Maybe you said that more resampling will increase the training.
Actually, great question, because I actually haven't. I have an experiment on this. You can find the paper, at least on arXiv, that questions how often can we resample.
Yes, exactly.
And one thing that we found is that in PPO you have to really balance the number of epochs and how often you kind of get fresh data. There's a very, very careful balance you have to strike. Kind of like not getting enough data and doing too few epochs on them is not good enough, but getting too much data and doing too many epochs on it is also bad. So you need to be kind of in the middle. REPO is very robust. Like basically there is kind of a sweet spot where you have enough data, but then increasing the data or increasing the number of epochs you run on it doesn't really hurt you in REPO, which is very nice, because one of the main advantages of REPO is not that it's right. Like a perfectly tuned PPO will most of the time be on par with REPO. There's basically always some hyperparameter configuration you can find to make PPO stable.
Yeah.
The main selling point of REPO is really it's so much more stable out of the box, because we've done so much to combat all of these like different sources of gradient variance that you just don't need two hyperparameter hyperparameter search for forever.
Yeah, exactly. And can I ask one more question?
Yeah.
If you have time. As I understand, we are training the critic and the policy networks in parallel, right?
Yes.
And here, do we, for example, update the critic with a more frequent gradients to get it fastly? I mean, to get a good critic.
I've played around with it a little bit. It doesn't matter. I basically just remove the update to data ratio hyperparameter, and like removing it just means setting it to 1 effectively.
Yeah.
It doesn't matter. Honestly, the critic fits really fast. There is some very deep theory to why on-policy critic learning is much easier than off-policy critic learning, which I didn't want to get into for reasons of time. This is actually a very rich thing. Roughly speaking, because we are on policy, we can get very long horizon TD lambda targets. So the target, the regression and the regression objective in the critic is very easy.
Okay, thank you very much.
We're slightly over time. I am not too tight on time, but if anybody still has a question, I'm very happy to answer it. Otherwise.
Yeah, can I ask a question?
Yeah.
Yeah, probably I might be wrong, but there was a slide, the slide where you mentioned that importance sampling is very bad, right? There's a slide on this. Yeah, so my question is it not intuitive that ordinarily that importance sampling is bad because it's just an approximation that we use to? So is this not intuitive in the first place?
Oh yes, yes, absolutely. It is not a particularly surprising result. It is a result that people tend to ignore, and that's why I stressed it so much. Right? When people talk about the problems in PPO and especially the gradient variance, importance sampling is never actually talked about that much. And actually, this was a huge discussion I had with the reviewers at iClear, and a good one. The reviewers were correct on that, because I had ignored this quite a bit. That experiment that I showed, I actually only added in the rebuttal because a reviewer asked me this. Because I was originally under the impression, which is the story you will find in the literature, that like, oh, it's the 0th order gradient, the score-based approximation that causes the variance, which is true to some extent. It is actually very true in like small toy domains. But for some reason, and I don't have the correct math on this, but there might be a theoretical explanation for this. In these high-dimensional policy parameterizations, it seems like the importance sample is actually what's driving most of your variance, which is intuitive in hindsight, but you will find almost no mention of it in the literature, which is the best insights, I feel.
Actually, that's true.
Things that are very intuitive in hindsight are things that I'm extra proud of.
Thank you.
No worries.
Right. So, in the interest of time, we can wrap up the session. Thanks for joining. Thanks for giving an insightful talk.
If anybody has more questions, always feel free to shoot me an email. Of course, can find it online. Just Google me.
Yeah, sure. Thank you. Thanks, Claas. It was fun.